longer you're alive and the more experiences you have, the more memories you have in your head, and the more opportunities you have to build associations among them. So your long-term memory store gets bigger and more complicated, both because there's more items in there and also because the network of the association gets more and more complicated, and some of them get built up quite strongly. So another, as you can see from the organization of the course, another kind of model, which in some ways is more of a method than a theory, is the lifespan developmental model. Again, we'll talk about this, and in fact you have Warner Shai's original paper about the methodology is one of the assigned readings in the Lawton and Salthouse book. But it's the math varies in different decades of this model being applied, but it's basically a way of separating out developmental effects of aging, where you're using chronological age as a rough marker of where you are in the life cycle or where you are in the process of human development through adulthood and aging, from cohort effects, which have to do with what year you were born, and therefore what cohort, or in the popular press we tend more often to say generation you're part of. So in any one-time comparison of people who are old and young, these things will kind of work out to be the same. But as you're looking at groups, different groups of people over different periods of time, one of the implications is that anything that's due to aging effects, when you're your parents' age, you'll sort of be like your parents. But if it's due to cohort effects, you'll be like you are now, only older. Because you stay a part of the same cohort all your life, right? But every year you get older. So this is the ways in which we think about, like, the World War II cohort, the Korean era cohort, the Boomer generation. Yeah, or like saying, like, my generation is another way kind of thinking about it. And so in those ways people stay stable over time, but you'll see differences between young people and old people at any point in time because they were born at different points in time and therefore kind of entered the social historical stream of life at different points in time and become adults at different points in time. I think this kind of a rough rule of thumb that I teach people that I'm talking to about therapy is that you think about, like, your client's birth year and then add about 20 to get a sense of when they became a young adult, and then think about what the world was like, what their world was like at that time, and what people were generally doing in terms of social values, morality, politics, what the kind of generational identifying markers were for them. So, sure, most of you know way more than you want to know about the Boomer generation because it controlled the media so far, but then you got Gen X and the digital generation come up behind. Yeah, Joe? I'll do a better job of this when we get to that lecture, but a simple answer, well, it's not so simple. The easiest way to think about it is the time effect is something that happens to everybody at one point in time. And so it would move all cohorts in the same direction at the same time. And so if you think that to the extent that the attack on the World Trade Center and their collapse, really affected everybody, that would be like a time effect. Now, it gets tricky because I think, in fact, a lot of the things that you would think of as time effects will probably be something more like time by cohort interactions, because cohorts will all have somewhat different reactions to the same event. but there are some things you can identify. I think within my adult lifespan anyway, I think the sort of the feminist wave of the 1970s probably affected all women and most men in somewhat similar ways, although what exactly was affected probably varied by cohort, for example. Women of all ages started wearing pants more, to take a really trivial example. But I think people got more assertive, people at all ages, women got more politically active, probably to some extent at all ages and so forth. Did that help? Okay. It gets complicated by the fact that when we look for reasons, the reasons often sound kind of similar too, although we're a lot more clear on what the effects are than what the reasons are. Life stage theories. These are like just enormously popular in textbooks and in the popular media. Unfortunately, they mostly just turn out to be wrong. Certainly as any kind of strong stage theories, although they are kind of interesting in clinical work, but they haven't inspired a whole lot of research, but when they've inspired research, the movement from one sort of theme stage to another just doesn't really seem to be that age-related. In fact, it's often more like social class or education-related rather than age-related, things like that. But certainly, Erickson, you can't really be a gerontologist without at least knowing something about Erickson, I suppose. And it's really a good idea to spell it right. Almost all the papers that I get, well, 2/3 of the papers I get, at least occasionally put a C in Erickson. And there isn't one in Erik Erickson's name. There's actually another psychologist who did hypnosis stuff, Milton Erickson, nothing to do with aging, who has a C in his name. But this guy doesn't. And probably a lot of what Erickson saw and interpreted as life stage theories is more what social gerontologists like Bernice Newgarten and Gunhild Hagestad would think of as age-graded social roles. And there is some consistency in experience as we go through life, but a lot of that is more like socially structured and socially defined, and it's actually loosened up a lot since the 60s and 70s too, so there's probably sort of less consistency there than there used to be when those ideas came out too. Here's a set of like social learning, social cognitive theories. Martin Seligman, who is probably, I guess, best known these days for like positive psychology, and actually started off doing learned helplessness stuff, which was really big in the early 80s everywhere, well, 70s and early 80s throughout psychology, and kind of maintained a major influence in gerontology probably until at least the early 90s. People seem to resonate with people that older adults would be helpless, and that and learned helplessness was sort of a good explanation for that. When he moved, he actually started doing this by shocking dogs and inducing learned helplessness. If you shock dogs enough and randomly, they quit moving around the cage. Not something that probably you could do anymore, but this was back in the 60s, and you could do a lot of stuff with animals back then and research. When he moved to humans, he gave up the electroshock stuff and started looking at causal attributions. And then there's another interesting thing that happened is that originally when he started working with humans, the theory was external causality because that was a better analog of the learned helplessness thing. The research actually, it turned out that it was internal causal attributions that were linked to depression, which was kind of like a total reversal that I don't know that he ever actually owned up to. I know I heard him do a colloquium right around the time that this research was new, and nobody in the audience could get him to acknowledge that he had changed his theory. We'll talk more about what these